Welcome to Eventual Consistency. I'm Ross. My guest is Matt Sekac from We Localize. Every week, there's another announcement about AI changing everything, another framework that's going to solve all your problems, another hot take about how you're doing data wrong. We're not here for that. We're here to talk about what's actually happening. Honestly, the way you talk about it with your team. Today on the podcast, Davos decided that the AI experimentation era is over. CEOs are demanding ROI, so let's talk about what that actually means from people building or using data systems. So the big story from Davos this year, business leaders have officially declared the AI experimentation era over. The message from the World Economic Forum was pretty blunt. After $1.5 trillion in AI investments last year, McKinsey found nearly 2/3 of companies have not scaled AI beyond pilots. Boards are done accepting, quote, AI activity as evidence of progress. They want measurable business outcomes. Siemens chairman Jim Hagemann Snabe actually told executives that CEOs need to be, quote, dictators on AI deployment. That's a strong word choice. According to Celonis, companies with AI centers of excellence see 8x higher returns than those with distributed approaches. And Celonis' CEO says you need three things for ROI in AI: strong leadership, that center of excellence structure, and live data connected to AI platforms. OpenAI and Anthropic are pivoting messaging toward enterprise ROI, with 40 to 80% of their revenue now coming from corporate customers. The success stories being cited at Davos include Siemens saving 30 to 100K euros per factory station with Ethan AI, Nestle Purina getting full payback from Boston Dynamics Spot robots within a year. But here's the thing. Those companies had decades of operational excellence investment before they touched AI. And the AI they're referring to isn't even large language models for the most part. So Matt, you've been leading data and analytics at We Localize for 6 years now, including through the entire AI hype cycle. What was your first reaction when you heard the experimentation era is over?
Look, I'm being glib. I do understand the idea here. And I think if you look into, the specifics of what a lot of the folks, what a lot of the CEOs and we're saying, a lot of the messaging, I don't know if it's quite that severe, but I do understand what they're trying to say. I don't think that the experimentation era can be over if we're starting from the premise that we haven't solved the problem of how to unlock all of the value potential of this new AI technology. So if we haven't solved the problem, you can't just wave your hand and make the need for experimentation go away. What is over is, or I guess what it sounds like folks are trying to put an end to, is the idea that activity counts as progress in and of itself, that you can do a pilot just for a pilot's sake, that you can not have a clear value hypothesis or an owner or a path to production and say that that's success. So I think from my seat, experimentation doesn't go away. It can't go away, but it needs to get more disciplined, right? And so the bar kind of changes from did we try something interesting to did we learn something that actually informs a decision or a real investment?
Just building on top of that, for a long time, just turning back the clock to 2022, we didn't really know what these tools were capable of. And since 2022, the capabilities of the tools have been evolving so quickly that some degree of experimentation was necessary in order to even understand what capabilities were present.
It's easy to forget that we're only 3 years into this technology even being widely available and existing. And you're absolutely right in terms of how quickly things evolve. We were just recently having a conversation about how you almost can't even have a 12-month roadmap anymore, because you can, but then what you end up doing in 6 months, what's available, what the priorities are, the market dynamics change that you're facing as an organization. So yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's especially true of your business. So before we get too much further, can you give an overview of We Localize's business and how We Localize is using AI today, and then maybe a little bit about your role too?
So We Localize provides translation, localization, and AI training data services to corporations all over the world, including a lot of the world's top tech companies. And at We Localize, AI isn't, I would really say it's not something we're just experimenting with on the side. It is increasingly embedded in how we deliver services, how we build products, how we think about building new products, and then actually how we run the business. So we use it all kinds of ways. One is directly in our core translation and localization workflows. Things like machine translation. AI actually predates ChatGPT and generative AI, right? But quality estimation tools, and now using LLMs and generative AI to like implementing systems like that sit alongside older technology and then humans to improve speed, quality, and consistency of products, to deliver more value to customers. Then internally, when it comes to platform and product, right, we are in how we actually deliver services and how we deploy our resources for customers. We're building AI enabled systems that help to orchestrate work at scale using agentic technology, and sort of making decisions about what gets done with machine, what gets done by machines, what gets done by humans, how that all fits together, what a good output even looks like, and how you're dealing with customer priorities. And then internal enablement, right? Helping our product teams write better stories and better epics, right? How we ship code faster. We've seen real productivity gains using generative AI in that area. How we make decisions more effectively. So my role kind of sits across all that, right? So as you said, I'm in charge of data and analytics for We Localize. That leaves me with maybe a broader remit than is obvious, right, within my organization. But I end up sort of less focused on any one model and more sort of focused on the ecosystem, right? So the data foundations that underlie all of those applications, the operating model, right? And how we measure impact on the operating model, what the guardrails are, and really just kind of connecting all of those things I'm talking about back to business reality, and in a way that lets AI actually create value in production. And this is going to be one of the things we end up talking a lot about, rather than just kind of looking nice in demos.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And just for people who are not familiar with the localization industry, some examples that come to mind for me are like you're a multinational corporation, rolling out marketing campaigns across different languages, and you want the outputs to be culturally sensitive and also relevant and also sound right in whatever language they're being in. Or maybe you're a pharmaceutical company and you need to do regulatory filings in a variety of different places. They're just innumerable situations in which you need the outputs to not seem like you just threw it into ChatGPT or into Google Translate and got the output, because you can't stand errors. Am I thinking about that right?
It almost like doesn't occur to you that it exists until you find out that it does, and then it's like, of course that exists, right? And you think about how much of what companies are these days is kind of words on a screen in the end, right? And so yeah, absolutely. I think one of the sort of most intuitive ones is a marketing campaign, right? Where if you are a global company and you're doing business in 100 countries, then you want your message to get out in those languages, right? And you want it to be culturally appropriate. You don't want it to just be like a straight translation. You want to make sure, obviously the classic example is the Chevy Nova, like doesn't go, right? But there's more sort of subtle stuff like that can come up, across cultures, across languages. And then, yeah, I mean, just even your user interface. If you're an architect who uses AutoCAD, all of those words on the screen are in English. Well, you would expect if you're an architect using that tool in Brazil that they would all be in Portuguese, right? And someone had to do that. And it's important that, whether it is UI strings or if it's informed consent forms for a clinical trial that we're doing in Argentina and we're doing in India, it's really important that that material be, accessible, understandable, and get the same message across to the target audience. And that ends up being hundreds of languages in a lot of cases.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, turning back to sort of experimentation in AI, like one of my favorite books that I've read recently is this book called The Origins of Efficiency by Brian Potter. It's this book that sort of traces the history of mechanization, primarily in manufacturing processes. And, one of the ways I really like to think about AI and LLMs in particular is that, we're in this moment where this is sort of the beginnings of mechanization of knowledge work. And so like what I love about what Potter talks about in The Origins of Efficiency is this idea that you don't mechanize a process by basically sticking a machine in and asking it to do the same thing that the human was doing previously. Like, the way that we manufacture nails today is very different than a blacksmith like hammering the head and then attaching it to a nail. Like it looks different. You have to redesign the process, and like reimagining that process is not something I would imagine without experimentation. And so, you're in this industry where translation has sort of been, under disruption from AI for, a good little period of time here. But then also there's this opportunity to take an industry where you are using humans and their expertise selectively to make sure that the quality remains high, but that requires like mass project management across varieties of different company inputs and outputs that need to be produced. So I'm just interested in hearing from you. Number one, like how does that sort of like redesign a process like resonate with you in terms of mechanization, and then how do you think that it influences the type of experimentation that you're doing versus the type of things that we have to move beyond experimentation?
I think that's a great analogy, a great comparison. It's absolutely true. What that also kind of leads to, right, is if you can't make your process for manufacturing nails more efficient with the machines, that doesn't mean the machines aren't good or don't have value, right? Like you shouldn't, it's not. And so because it really does compare nicely to what I think is going on here, where I think a lot of problems with like how to, because the theme of a lot of this is like, all right, we've been pouring a ton of money into this stuff. Like, okay, come on, like when do we get the money back? Like when do we get we need that R, right? There's been a lot of I, like where's the R? I think in a lot of cases, they're not AI technology problems. They might be orchestration technology problems. They might be data technology problems, but like a lot of times they are process problems, right? And I actually think that with LLMs, it probably is closer to possible that you can just ask an LLM to kind of improvise the same thing you've got a human doing, but that's also wrong and not how you're going to get ROI. Like it's maybe not impossible, but it's not the best way to do it. And where we've been, one of the kind of main initiatives at We Localize that we have sort of started as an experiment last year and has evolved now into something as a more focused initiative with P&L impact expected against it, right? But is using agentic AI to automate certain classes of task that are just difficult to automate with kind of traditional rules-based agents, right? And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but like a lot of it comes down to just the fact that you have people spending time doing things that should be automatable, but are so varied across, whether it's across customers or across workflows or across programs or across service profiles or whatever, that you could maybe do it, but you would end up with a ton of technical debt and it would take a ton of time, right? But where there's like a sort of flexibility that you get from the reasoning capability of LLMs that gave us this hypothesis that we could use agents to actually, go in there and make them configurable, not necessarily by like a trained developer, right? Where, the famous quote, the programming language of the future is English, right? There's still a lot of work to do to set up the orchestration platform for that, right? And there's a lot of work to do to make sure that, we have data that helps us validate that things are working, that helps us make sure that we're not causing problems, and that helps us actually measure and assess whether it's having an efficiency impact. But then the other thing you have to do is you have to really look at your processes and ask whether like that is the thing that you want to try to automate, or whether there are actually needless redundancies in there. Are there like, checks or extra steps or offline trackers or things that maybe made sense 3 or 4 or 5 years ago? The fact is that like, and I think this is probably true of a lot of companies, your processes weren't designed with these capabilities in mind. And so I think it's an opportunity though, because it's, when you get into it, it also requires like real buy-in though, right? It requires everybody to kind of be aligned and moving in the same direction and interested in driving and cooperating and asking questions and challenging what the status quo is. And then thinking about like, okay, like less about how are we going to automate this sequence of steps, and more almost starting from blank sheet of paper and saying, I have these inputs, I need to get to these outputs. What's the best way to do that, right? And obviously you're going to end up using a lot of the same steps because there are going to be things that have to happen, but like really just looking at it that way, that's I think a good just mental model or frame for cutting some of the fat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So like, a couple things that I heard from you there. Number one is that like you've got people processes that have built up over years to sort of like account and compensate for the strengths and weaknesses of humans, and use this, humans, which kind of the ultimate general purpose technology to accomplish a particular process. But ultimately what you've done is you have to start with like boiling it down to the inputs and the outputs, and then knowing, now that we've done this exploratory experimentation with these models to know what their capabilities are, we have to look at that blank sheet of paper and ask ourselves, what would this process look like if we wanted to automate it from beginning to end? And that has implications for not just the architecture of what kinds of agents you're using, which tasks you're assigning them, how you're orchestrating them, how they're interfacing with each other, but also, where is the human essential? And then the other thing I heard was like, how do we gain the monitoring and the observability of the system so that we understand whether we're actually, getting value from this new approach that we're doing, but also we can improve over time. We can diagnose the problems that the new system has, and we have like a flywheel that's going to get this process more and more effective over time. And I think that's one of the places where it's really hard. Please.
It's also not just about like, just eliminating these tasks or whatever, right? You could look at some of the things that are going on. You see all these clicks that are happening, right? And it's like, I gotta go here, I gotta go here, I gotta go there, right? It's, one question is like, is that how I want to spend my human capital, right? Is that where they add the most value? The other thing with respect to that last bit about, trying to make sure that there are structures and methods in place to like validate that that the agents are being successful. It helps to build confidence in the user and in the individual, because these workflows that we're contemplating do retain human in the loop to validate, because even small mistakes can, it's maybe not the end of the world, but it can jeopardize a relationship with a customer. But then it can undermine confidence not only from the customer, but then also within the organization that you're trying to make better, right? And we'll get to the dictator's comment, I guess, but like you do really kind of need like persuasion and buy-in, I think, for these things to be really successful.
Siemens chairman says that CEOs need to be dictators on AI deployment. So, what do you think about that?
Well, look, the first thing I thought, I guess, was maybe a little pedantic, because, it was kind of like, wait, aren't CEOs always already dictators, right? Like they don't have a legislature or judiciary in most corporate org charts, right? But like, here's the question is like, well, like what do they dictate, right? And like how opinionated are they? And then like how far down do they exert influence? And look, I'll say this, like I do think there's some validity to this, in the sense that like I maybe would not choose that language, right? But like what I think our experience would validate is that you do need like an imperative from leadership, to like a sort of top-down imperative to really drive transformational change. I'd just say that I don't think that that's like particularized to AI and this new technology. I just think that that's always true, right? Like it's always true that if you want to have if you really want like transformational change, there does need to be like consensus and support, right? But like consistent messaging and an imperative from above for that to really happen. And I'll give you like, because when I saw this, I like went down a rabbit hole. I was reading about fax machines, right? So depending on where you are, your doctor's office might still use fax machines, right? Like basically like email has been like Pareto superior to fax machines for like at least 20, probably more like 30 years, right? You still had there are examples in I think Japan and Canada in particular, where they had like major elements of their healthcare system were still using fax machines as like the normal course of business. And what it took to make it go away is somebody saying, you're going to make this go away. That's it, right? Somebody giving a direct order, being a dictator if you like, and just saying like we're just not going to use fax machines anymore. Like I don't care why you think we should. Like the rabbit hole is like, well, why do they still want to use fax machines? The answer was basically, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so I think like look, that age old saying is actually maybe broken. Like it actually might be broke, because that mentality like doesn't play for what I think enterprises want to accomplish with this technology, right? Things that don't feel broken, you don't want to fix. Humans just, it's a human thing, right? Like there's a resistance to change. So I do think overcoming that does require like a top-down imperative. But look, like you pointed out, that's strong language. Like top-down imperatives matter, but like a fully coercive posture, right, without any buy-in, there's a sort of spectrum between coercion and persuasion. And just like abandoning persuasion, I just think that can backfire, right? Like it's you want strategic insistence, not just like base compliance, right? Because in the end, like you're gonna have to delegate something. Like you could be a dictator or whatever you want to say, but like in most organizations, like the chief executive is not going to be able to make every single decision for every single employee, right? And so there are going to be like strategic decisions that need to be made along the way, and everybody being on the same page and bought in is part of that too.
Yeah, that term strategic insistence really resonates with me. Like what we do is we go into organizations and we, like assess and develop and deliver and implement, data infrastructure and AI driven systems. And, the thing that one of the main differentiators between a project that we expect to be successful and a project that we don't expect to be successful is, are we connected to the leadership of the organization who will ultimately determine what the value of the system being implemented, or, the process being implemented is. And so, I love that strategic insistence, because CEOs know in some ways better than anyone else in the organization, what are the sources of value in the organization? What are the sources of cost in the organization? And so they can point the organization in the direction of, if we focus our attention at trying to mechanize, at trying to, bring these AI capabilities into our processes more effectively, we're going to be able to see the value. But that's a strategic that's a strategic assessment, and ultimately, that's the place where the CEO can play. But if they're just, I think there's sort of two ways this can go. It can be the CEO dictating across the board, just use more AI, and then, obviously, like if all you're doing is assessing the capabilities of it and seeing where it might be useful, I think that that's possibly good. But if, you're really expecting to get returns and, not have so many experiments fail, then, being more targeted, being more strategic about that posture is going to be useful. And then the other way is sort of micromanaging what the business does, and saying, you business unit, you need to implement AI to automate this particular process, and it needs to be agentic, and it needs to, it could be actually that the efficiencies that business is going to get are going to come from, you know, better integration between their existing software systems, a supervised learning model that makes a decision that humans are making or that is being made inappropriately right now, and that, putting LLMs in the mix there is naturally going to fail. And so I just think that there's that, like, obviously CEOs care about, marshaling the resources, the expertise of the organization to accomplish these really important strategic goals. But I think, obviously when you talk about headlines from Davos and stuff like that, some stuff can get lost in the mix.
And that's I think that's what's going to happen, because actually what you described is, I think, kind of like going from like a just use more AI to, okay, but now we need a value hypothesis when we're going to like make a new investment, and focusing our attention and energy in those directions, insisting on that. I think it's natural, though. I mean, I'd say that I think that that's how we've always looked at it. But it's not going to happen by magic.
And I also just think that it's important that, like, every organization and every leader within the organization sort of knows where you are on the explore versus exploit spectrum with regards to this technology, because, like, there are emerging use cases that should be explored, and if you don't explore them, then there's going to be nothing to exploit later on. But, what we're hearing from largely CEOs and chairmen of big enterprise is that the time for exploration has come to a close and the time for exploitation is here. And, I think that typically these organizations have already invested a lot of resources in understanding their process, in mechanizing their processes. So it makes sense to me that they would be closer to exploit than organizations in the middle market or organizations more toward the startup phase, where the capabilities of these tools, if you design around them rather than trying to integrate them into your existing business processes, there might be something transformational that can happen. And so, like, obviously, if there are more opportunities to find like something transformational, you should be doing more exploring. If there's if there's just more opportunity to get value from, further automating something already works, then that's where then you should definitely be on the exploit side of the equation. So I think that sometimes gets lost in messaging like this too.
I agree with that.
Cool. Well, we mentioned earlier that there's an 8x difference, ROI difference. I think this is from Celonis's CEO, that there's an 8x ROI difference from having an AI center of excellence rather than having implementation be distributed. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I honestly, I think that actually goes back to what we were talking about before. It's kind of in the same vein. An AI center of excellence isn't magic, right? Like my guess is, yeah, okay, so that was based on a study. If all the organizations that didn't have one just sort of like stood up a committee to meet every couple of weeks and called it an AI center of excellence, that would not itself have really impacted, like have had much of an impact on the outcomes. Like it's like in some ways having a really effective center of excellence is like maybe as much result as like cause of it, because it's connected back to like the operational maturity we were discussing before, and like companies like Siemens and Nestle have laid a lot of the foundations already, right? They've built operations that are rigorous and matured, and built processes that we were talking about, like the analogy with the nail and manufacturing that versus a human process, like and kind of how that looked for us as well. If you've done that already, you obviously have a head start. We are only a few years into this. Like it's actually something we've talked about, right? Internally here is, to what extent does it, would we expect it to really have an impact? Like I think it's really looking at, what are the things that your center of excellence would be meant to actually deliver, and then, solutioning it from there. Does it make sense to have like a standing committee or whatever in a meeting, or like, does that just start to feel like bureaucracy? I think really what you're trying to do is kind of develop a muscle of like repeated problem solving. And then you are trying also to make sure that there's a kind of concentration of influence to help sort of steer and evaluate. And I don't know that like a formalized center of excellence is the only way to accomplish that, but I do hear the argument that says that like the more kind of distributed and diffuse it is, maybe it might be challenging. Some of it might depend on how big your organization is. The only other thing I think I would want to call out there, though, is I do think there is like a risk to over centralizing as well and suppressing broader innovation. Because while we have thought about this, like the truth is that like one of the things we're really thinking about lately is what can we do to actually unlock and harness, because one of the other things that they said that was talked about is like, giving everybody Chat GPT, is kind of a failed experiment. And there's that sort of perception out there. I don't really think that that's true. I think in order for that to be true, it means that like your value hypothesis for your experiment was probably off, right? Like, I don't think like, okay, everybody, like here's a Chat GPT Pro license, or I think what more organizations are doing is kind of standing up their own sort of walled off instance of GPT-5 or whatever. But like, okay, and then now I just expect my company to become 30% more efficient in a year or two. Like, that's not going to happen. But what it does accomplish is it builds, like, it's foundational, I think, is our point of view, right? Is like, it gets people comfortable with it, not afraid of it. It develops like literacy, right? And then adoption, like that's foundational to unlocking some of these things. It does leave you with some like weird counterfactuals, and it's going to be a lot of your ROI is going to be on like a counterfactual basis, right? If it's sales enablement or customer engagement, like we make better PowerPoints, we get them out faster, our RFP responses are cleaner, like whatever, like okay, so does that mean we wouldn't have won that account? Or some of it might just be table stakes in terms of keeping up with competition, right? But once you've sort of laid the groundwork or the foundation of like the literacy and adoption and engagement with it, you do, I think, have potential to unlock like latent innovation and insight capability that like exists throughout the whole organization. Our quality team does not contain developers, okay? But first using ChatGPT and then hearing about tools like Replit and V0, right? These kind of vibe coding tools, using ChatGPT to figure out how to learn these, to figure out how best to use these tools, which then do code, but going from there to actually like coming up with some creative solutions that we can deploy in production to some just like kind of weird, annoying, tricky problems that come up in the course of localization. Things like it turns out that like a user interface string, in some cases, like there's a rule that it can't exceed 150 characters. But if it's 144 in English and you translate it into Spanish, then it might break the limit. And so you got to, and that just like, that throws errors. It pisses the customer off, like, or we have to do rework, or we have to go think about it. And just, that's just one like tiny little example of the kind of thing that comes up, but where the quality team has managed to reduce rework, has managed to make us look better to customers, and has made it so that we are delivering a higher quality product to our customers, right? Done that on their own, right? Like just, they get some support in terms of like deploying it and making sure there's security and stuff like that. But like going from just it's building it themselves. And that's the kind of thing that I think we want to see more of, not less. It has to be controlled. Obviously there are other concerns, but you get it.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I love sense, and I love that anecdote. I think, my outlook on sort of mandates for org chart changes as like solutions to problems. I'm always skeptical of org chart as a solution to any problem, because I think that like organizations can have very different structures and still be successful in those structures. It's really like, how does the org chart intersect with your business model? How does it intersect with sort of the variety of business lines that you have? How does it intersect with the human talent that you have inside your organization that can, manage and oversee different sections of the business? So like this centers of excellence model, like it's great when you're more on the exploit side and you want reusable components that you can use across the organization, and exactly what's happening across the organization. So the institutional knowledge of what's happening of the processes is already centralized. You've got the CEO mandate, so they can open all the doors. They've got all of the API keys and all of the database credentials that they need to pipe the things together, and they've got the sufficient resources and the freedom to experiment. But if you're not in a situation where like all of those things are available, for example, like I doubt that someone in the executive team at We Localize would have been able to say that the quality team was going to have those particular issues when interfacing with customers, nor that if they gave them AI tools, they'd be able to like bootstrap themselves, resolve the problem themselves. And then, once you have that in place, then you can start like centralizing those sorts of things. So I think you make a really great point about sort of the balance between these things, and how you create an environment where that innovation is encouraged, but also make sure that you're standardizing and that you're exploiting as well as you can. And so it feels more like a two-step, and this center of excellence red herring feels more like something that's great when you have an enterprise scale manufacturing organization where every factory is doing things the exact same way, sort of things, or where that knowledge is really well centralized already.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's self-reinforcing, right? It's like you see examples like that, and that gives other folks ideas. And then you can end up with like more kind of centralized initiatives to kind of, whether it's like blowing something like that or taking that concept and maybe it could be applied elsewhere. So, I do think that like some sort of centralized leadership and direction, and trying to focus on looking for focused opportunities with like really plausible value hypotheses, right? And investing there and having centralized resources to invest there, like that is part of it, right? But stuff can bubble up that can really kind of help drive that.
Yeah. And I think, your status is sort of like an emerging enterprise or a mid-market organization, depending on on your definition, sort of puts you in a place where like both are imperative. And that's like sort of a challenging area to navigate. We're almost out of time. Is there anything on the list that you want to make sure that we get to before I let you go?
I think in this whole conversation about ROI, one of the things that I think is important is trying to develop, like, I guess I'll say like a mature idea for like what ROI means, right? One of the topics that we've been kind of talking about is like foundations versus, like what things are foundational. That could be your operations process, it could be your data. Do you have the right data to measure things? But then also, like, how do you think about ROI? Because it's not just mass layoffs and cost reduction, right? And I do think that like that's the tone that people get when they hear, talk about ROI. But I could tell you in our organization, like that's nothing like the only one, right? Like, or even the main one that we've realized so far, right? Dev productivity, we saw like a 30% increase in code shipped using some of these, LLM based tools that, that you can plug into, again, with product helping, with crafting better stories and epics more quickly, but then also in kind of drafting the code. That was an example of where it did take some pressure from leadership, because with the development team saying like, y'all are going to try this, and then seeing that it worked, where we've seen a 30% increase in productivity or in output with a considerable reduction in errors. So you're shipping more code to the organization faster and with fewer bugs being spotted in QA. What that does, our organization, like We Localize, is really focused on AI and technology generally in terms of, they're, as you could probably imagine, large language models are disruptive to a language industry, and it creates a turbulent, highly competitive situation where we are investing a lot in technology to develop new products. That extra productivity helps us keep up with the rapidly escalating, appetite from the business to invest in what developers do. It didn't mean that we fired 30% of our developers. Another angle is like your offering, right? One of our key actually AI applications is a product that we've been deploying called, that we're rolling out called Opal Enable. All right. And, you were asking sort of at the top about like kind of what localization looks like, and talking about all of this volume of content that needs to get shipped and translated into all these languages and distributed through all these channels. And the way that the content generation and distribution lifecycle looks is like kind of a big part of the puzzle that we have to solve, because that's evolving too. But when we look at, okay, where's a use case for AI? I think the first thing a lot of people think of is like, oh, well, like LLMs are just going to do the translation. What we found is actually by using LLM technology and like classical neural machine translation technology with human in the loop, you get the best output. And that actually, instead of having the LLM do the translation instead of MT, if you have the LLM, if you do a machine translation and then you ask the LLM to fix it, you say, here you go, like now your job is to like edit it, like revise it, make it better, you end up with like a measurably better outcome, quality outcome. And then your human in the loop is more efficient, right? So if they used to have to take it from a 4 or 5 to 10, now they're taking it from 6, 7, or 8 to 10, right? So the human's more efficient, and you're using the human's time more valuably. And you're also coming up with a higher quality output along the way. That is of value to customers. One of the things it does is it lets them ship marketing content more quickly. Like we have an example of a client where it was a 50% increase in their speed to market with some of their branded content, all right, and some of their marketing content and stuff like that. Like that's a material ROI for the business. Would we have lost that client otherwise? But it does enhance our offering and our competitive positioning. And yeah, you certainly expect it to manifest in revenue over time, right? But there are a lot of different ways to look at that. And I think that that's kind of important too, right? Is thinking about AI value in ways that aren't just strictly about cost reduction, right? That's not to be like afraid of efficiency, or like it's that it really can manifest in a lot of ways. Even like might even require you to redefine quality and rethink about what your benchmarks are. And, and that's, we've been working with Duke University, our alma mater, on, setting new benchmarks for what translation quality looks like. That's part of the game too, right? And that's part of the foundational element of how you end up measuring things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a couple of ideas that occurred to me as I was hearing you talk. One is that when you're talking about sort of people-based processes and the way that people are using AI, the intangible benefits precede the tangible benefits. A part of being a great business leader is being able to understand what the intangible benefits are and like accept them as a valid way of measuring things, because sometimes measuring things as rigorously as you would like to measure them requires more resources than you're really willing to invest in the measurement artifice. But then there's other situations where like when you're talking about sort of the integration of LLMs with neural machine translation, like you've already got this business process, the business, you plug the LLM in there, you can see immediately, you're already keeping track of the quality scores of the things that you're seeing at different phases, so you can immediately see sort of the tangible benefit of that. But that's because you've already set up the measurement interface, the measurement architecture.
That's right. And the whole foundations question keeps coming up because it's important. And where if you're a data team, like you've got a responsibility too. Like it's you need to see what's going on, right? And I think it's like there's every reason to anticipate that this kind of stuff is going to become more and more important and more of a priority in lots of different organizations. And while it is really important that there be alignment and like a reasonable point of view around what ROI is, but then also what it's going to take to deliver that ROI. I mean, I think it's okay for me to say, Ross, that like, we worked with your organization in large part because we were thinking proactively about what we need, what we need our data infrastructure to look like in order to be positioned for all of this stuff that we want to do. And it might not be an emergency now. It might not be that but where the direction we see ourselves going, what do we need to be doing as a data organization to get us better positioned to scale with all of this ambition that the company's got, right? And so that's a data team's responsibility, but then it also needs to come, there also needs to be like, I don't want to say patience exactly, but like an understanding that some of these more foundational investments might need to be made either at the same time as or before. Sometimes maybe you could do them together, but like they might be like just absolutely necessary to actually achieve the kinds of things that you want to have, like live data connected to AI systems. Well, I mean, okay, like what does live mean? Like we have to establish that, right? And then, are our systems set up to deliver if that's, is that hourly, is that every minute, right? Like, and then does the R&D team, are they equipped into their structures? Are they to actually like take the data, even if it is available at that cadence, at that pace, right? So everybody's really got to be on the same page on all of this stuff.
Before I let you go, what's one thing brewing in the data and localization space, or just in the industry at large, that you're watching right now?
I think for us, one of the things we're watching everything because everything's changing and turned upside down. It seems like every 3 to 5 months, right? But just the way that these content pipelines, like these content generation and distribution pipelines, are evolving, and the technology being used to kind of augment and supplement them. Obviously, we're developing a product now that we think plugs and integrates well with like what a modern and sort of future state content distribution pipeline looks like, and allows you to kind of incorporate these capabilities with human in the loop and with technology and with some pretty cutting edge technology to get the outcomes that you want. But the way that customers' attitudes about those things evolve, the way that content is generated in the first place, right? And then the kind of ecosystem of localization technologies, and that evolves too, right? Because there start to become opportunities for companies that provide like kind of enablement tools to actually become more like competitors. And then there also are situations where those enablement tools can actually be displaced by creative services from traditional service providers, right? And so LLMs are ultimately about like language and text, and like that's our business. So the stuff that we touch and the way that it flows to audiences is evolving. That's something we really have to have our finger on, pretty constantly.
And on my end, there's this great article in New York Times today. This is Monday, February 2nd, where they bring together a bunch of leaders and people I respect in AI to talk about sort of predictions for the future of AI. And Nick Frost, the CEO of Cohere, had this quote that, AI will become boring in the best way. It'll fade into the background like GPS or spreadsheets, powering everyday tools and humans at work. It's the most banal use cases that have the most transformative impact. That just really resonated with me because I feel like, what we have is this diffuse, uneven intelligence that we're trying to apply in all of these different ways. And the uneven nature of it is sort of tantalizing and it's exciting. It makes you believe that anything is possible, but the diffuse nature of it also means that it can just be applied in so many places and in so many different ways. And so sort of like the number of ideas you can have about the applications for generative AI in particular, and broader machine learning and AI in general, it's just really fun. It's really fun to think about. And like things like project management that you were discussing earlier, those are really like some of the banal use cases that have like the most opportunity.
The way I think about it, the way I always think about it, or like the thing I like to say is it actually is a magic wand. You still have to figure out the spells. And like that takes a lot of work, right? Like you still have to figure out like what to do with it, right? And it doesn't have an instruction manual, right?
Thank you, Matt. That's it for this episode of Eventual Consistency. If you want to talk about your data challenges or you think we got something wrong and want to tell us how, you can find us at Cordon.com. That's CORRDYN.com. We're doing this every 2 weeks. We'll see you next time, where maybe we'll get a touch more consistent. Thanks for listening.